Did Hitler's generals see him as a military genius or a reckless gambler dragging Germany into ruin? Some generals stayed loyal to the bitter end. Others plotted against him. This is the story of how Hitler's most powerful commanders judged his leadership, from triumph to collapse. When Adolf Hitler came to power in January 1933, Germany's army, then called the Reichswehr, was a small force of just 100,000 men. It was restricted by the Treaty of Versailles, underfunded, and lacking prestige. Many officers hoped a strong leader would restore their pride and rebuild military strength. To them, Hitler seemed to offer exactly that. General Werner von Blomberg, Minister of War, and General Werner von Fritsch, Commander-in-Chief of the army, quickly aligned themselves with the new regime. Both believed Hitler's promises to expand the army and overturn the humiliations of Versailles. By giving the generals resources, new weapons programs, and political backing, Hitler won their loyalty in the first years of his rule. The reoccupation of the Rhineland in March 1936 became a key moment. German forces moved into the demilitarized zone, risking a French military response. Hitler's generals were nervous, knowing the army was not yet strong enough for a full war. Yet France and Britain did nothing. The success impressed many officers, convincing them that Hitler's boldness could succeed where cautious planning might fail. General Alfred Jodl later admitted in his post-war testimony that while many feared disaster, Hitler's gamble left the officer corps full of admiration. Hitler continued to reward the military. The Wehrmacht expanded rapidly. By 1939, it had grown to millions of men, equipped with tanks, aircraft, and modern weapons. Officers received higher pay, new commands, and opportunities for promotion. For ambitious generals, Hitler's leadership looked like a chance to restore Germany's greatness and their own careers. The Anschluss with Austria in March 1938, followed by the Sudeten crisis later that year, strengthened this impression. Once again, Hitler took huge risks but achieved success without war. When Germany absorbed Austria and parts of Czechoslovakia, many generals felt their leader was achieving what had seemed impossible just years before. Still, not all officers were convinced. General Ludwig Beck, Chief of the General Staff, resigned in August 1938 after repeated arguments with Hitler. Beck warned in his memoranda that Hitler's plans would lead to the collapse of the German nation. His departure signaled that doubts existed within the High Command, though most others stayed silent or fell in line. The so-called Blomberg-Fritsch affair in 1938 further cemented Hitler's dominance. Both generals were forced out, Blomberg after a marriage scandal and Fritsch after false accusations of misconduct. Historians still argue whether Hitler engineered these scandals or merely exploited them. What is clear is that the dismissals allowed him to reorganize the military leadership with loyal figures like Wilhelm Keitel, who would serve him faithfully to the end. By 1939, on the eve of war, Hitler's generals were a mix of believers and skeptics. Many admired his daring and credited him with restoring Germany's power. A smaller number already feared he was reckless, but most, tied to their careers and the army's revival, chose loyalty, at least for now. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, Hitler's generals saw the risk of a wider war. Many doubted Germany could withstand a long conflict against both Britain and France. Yet within weeks, the Polish campaign ended in victory. The speed of success surprised even senior officers. Hitler's prestige soared. The following spring and summer brought even greater triumph. In May 1940, German forces launched their Blitzkrieg attack on France. The plan, involving a rapid armored thrust through the Ardennes, went against the cautious instincts of many generals. Chief of the General Staff, Franz Halder, worried the plan was too risky, but the operation worked spectacularly. Within 6 weeks, France, a country that had resisted Germany for 4 years in the First World War, had collapsed. Generals who once doubted Hitler now praised his intuition. Halder confided in his diary that Hitler's judgment had been vindicated, though he added privately, "He is intoxicated with success." Hitler used these triumphs to tighten control over the army. In February 1938, he had already replaced the old high command structure with the OKW, or Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, which reported directly to him. Now, after the victories in Poland and France, he sidelined independent staff work even more. Loyal subordinates such as Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl gained influence, while more independent-minded officers were marginalized. The invasion of Norway and Denmark in April 1940 also displayed this pattern. Some generals opposed the plan, warning that Germany's navy was too weak to protect such operations. Hitler pushed forward anyway, and again he was proven right. The occupation succeeded, though at the cost of several warships. When Hitler prepared for Operation Barbarossa in 1941, doubts became sharper. The scale of the invasion of the Soviet Union, involving millions of men across a vast front, alarmed many officers. Generals like Halder and Brauchitsch worried the campaign was too ambitious and could not be sustained. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch later told interrogators that he had warned Hitler of the risks but was brushed aside with what he described as a torrent of abuse. Some scholars question if the general's doubts were truly about strategy or timing. While many recognized the logistical dangers, others shared Hitler's belief that Soviet weakness made victory certain. The early victories in June and July 1941, with German armies advancing hundreds of miles, seemed to confirm Hitler's confidence, but the seeds of future disaster had been planted. By the end of 1941, Hitler's generals were caught in a dilemma. On the one hand, they witnessed stunning victories that defied their cautious assessments. On the other hand, they saw him overriding professional advice more and more. Admiration remained, but tension was growing. By 1942, the glow of Hitler's early victories was fading. The war in the Soviet Union dragged on, and his relationship with generals began to fracture. Many had once admired his daring, but now they saw his stubbornness leading Germany into catastrophe. After the initial successes, the Wehrmacht stalled before Moscow in the winter. Hitler refused to allow retreats, insisting his armies hold their ground at all costs. Some units froze in the snow, suffering heavy losses. General Heinz Guderian argued for strategic withdrawals to preserve forces. Hitler dismissed him and sent him into a temporary retirement. This was a warning to all. Defying Hitler could end a career. In 1942, Hitler launched a new offensive toward the Caucasus oil fields and the Volga city of Stalingrad. Many generals considered the plan too ambitious. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock voiced doubts about the split of forces, but Hitler ignored him and replaced him with Field Marshal Wilhelm List. Once again, loyalty mattered more than military judgment. As the Battle of Stalingrad dragged into late 1942, the clash between Hitler and his generals deepened. Surrounded in the city, the German Sixth Army under Friedrich Paulus asked permission to break out. Hitler refused, ordering them to stand fast. He promoted Paulus to Field Marshal in January 1943, expecting him to take his own life rather than surrender. Instead, Paulus capitulated with more than 90,000 men. In Soviet captivity, Paulus later testified at Nuremberg, "I was ordered to fight to the last man, but I could not justify the further sacrifice of my army." Other senior commanders were also disillusioned. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, widely regarded as one of Germany's most skilled strategists, urged Hitler to allow flexible withdrawals and counterattacks. At times, Hitler listened, especially during Manstein's counteroffensive at Kharkov in early 1943. Yet the relationship was tense. In his memoirs, Manstein wrote that Hitler's interference turned strategy into a series of improvised orders dictated by emotion. Meanwhile, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt expressed his frustration in private conversations, calling Hitler's decisions madness. But like many others, he obeyed orders, unwilling to openly rebel. Some scholars argue this showcased cowardice or complicity. Others suggest the generals feared not only dismissal, but also punishment for their families if they resisted. The defeat at Stalingrad, followed by German setbacks in North Africa and the Soviet advance at Kursk in 1943, broke the illusion of Hitler's infallibility. More officers began to speak in hushed tones about the need to remove him. General Ludwig Beck, who resigned in 1938, became a symbolic figure for resistance. Networks of disaffected officers, such as those around Klaus von Stauffenberg, started to plan more seriously for a coup. By the end of 1943, the mood in the German officer corps had shifted. The same men who once praised Hitler's daring now saw him as the cause of ruin, yet their frustration rarely translated into action. Obedience, habit, and fear still held most in check. By 1944, the German generals faced a stark reality. Hitler was losing the war, and his leadership was dragging the Reich toward destruction. For many officers, the question was no longer whether he was right, but whether it was possible or even safe to oppose him. The year began with military setbacks. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets launched massive offensives, pushing the Wehrmacht steadily westward. In the West, the Allies prepared for an invasion of France. Hitler still demanded that every position be held, forbidding retreats even when collapse was inevitable. Generals who argued for maneuver and flexibility found themselves overruled. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, commanding in the West, advised withdrawal during the Normandy campaign. Hitler refused and replaced him. Rundstedt's weary comment, "Make peace, you fools," reflected the despair in the officer corps. Some generals moved beyond frustration to outright conspiracy. The July 20, 1944 plot was the most dramatic attempt to remove Hitler. Led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg and supported by former Chief of Staff Ludwig Beck, the plan sought to assassinate Hitler with a bomb and seize control of the government. Many generals knew of the plan or sympathized with it, but only a few actively joined. When the attempt failed, Hitler unleashed brutal reprisals. Beck took his own life, Stauffenberg was executed, and hundreds of officers were arrested or killed. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, though not directly involved, had told colleagues that Hitler was leading Germany into the abyss. Even this private doubt sealed his fate. Rommel was forced to take poison later that year. Even as his grip on reality weakened, Hitler still had loyal defenders. Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl continued to follow his orders without question. To the end, they treated his word as law. Historians often describe them as examples of blind obedience, men who valued loyalty over independent judgment. Others fell into despair but could not break away. Field Marshal Walter Model, often called Hitler's fireman for his role in crisis commands, became increasingly pessimistic. He no longer believed in victory, but still refused to join conspiracies. For men like Model, professional duty and fear outweighed political opposition. By early 1945, Hitler's rants against traitorous generals became frequent. He blamed them for defeats rather than acknowledging his own mistakes. In the bunker in Berlin, he remained convinced that disloyalty, not flawed strategy, had ruined his campaigns. His remaining generals were divided between those who clung to loyalty and those who quietly awaited the inevitable end. Keitel, in his final statement at Nuremberg, admitted, "Obedience became for me the highest law, and in the end, the greatest misfortune." After the war, at the Nuremberg trials, many surviving generals tried to distance themselves from Hitler. Some, such as Manstein and Rundstedt, presented themselves as professionals who had disagreed with him but could not openly resist. Some scholars question whether these defenses were sincere or self-serving. What is clear is that the generals as a whole bore responsibility, both for their obedience and for their failures to act. The collapse of 1945 sealed their legacy. Some had admired Hitler, others had doubted him, but most had followed him. In the end, their loyalty tied them to both his triumphs and his downfall. Well, that's it for today's video. Thank you for watching. If you found this video insightful, make sure to check out our other videos about the lives of German generals. And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next video. And we'll see you in the next one.